At the will reading, they handed a veteran Navy SEAL just $5 and a worn-out library card, and the room filled with quiet laughter. He said nothing, but his dog didn't laugh, because it sensed something no one else could. Because sometimes, what looks like an insult is actually the beginning of a hidden truth. Out in the northern forest, a forgotten place was waiting, silent, patient, untouched. Not for a rich man, but for someone who had already lost everything and kept going. And a loyal dog, whose instincts would lead them towards something far greater than money. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe to Veteran Dog Stories. Silas Wren stepped into the law office on a cold northern morning. The kind of cold that didn't just sit on your skin. It settled into your bones and stayed there. Pale gray light filtered through the tall glass windows, revealing a distant line of pine trees stretching across the horizon. They looked quiet, still, like they knew something the town had long forgotten. He didn't belong here. Not in the polished silence of this room, where the scent of leather and expensive wood lingered in the air. Not among people who wore tailored coats and soft expressions sharpened by quiet judgment. Silas carried the weight of a different world, one that smelled like dust, metal, and gunpowder. One that didn't care about appearances. He stood tall at 1.85 meters, broad-shouldered, his frame still carrying the discipline of a Navy SEAL long after the uniform was gone. His olive field jacket had faded at the cuffs, worn from years of use. Beneath it, a red and dark blue plaid shirt rested against a chest that had once carried armor. His cargo pants were practical, his brown leather boots scuffed and weathered, each mark earned somewhere far from rooms like this. A military watch clung to his wrist, old, scratched, still ticking. His face told the rest of the story. Angular, defined, a jawline carved by time and restraint. Stubble traced his chin and cheeks, not careless, but unbothered. His blue-gray eyes were the only part of him that seemed truly alive, scanning the room the way they once scanned rooftops and ridgelines. Always watching, always calculating. At his side, lying perfectly still, was Rook. The German shepherd's black and tan coat caught the dim light, muscles subtly shifting beneath it with each quiet breath. About 5 or 6 years old, built like a soldier, balanced, lean, and ready. His eyes were deep, focused, never drifting. He wasn't resting. He was waiting, watching, reading the room in ways most humans couldn't. Silas didn't need to look down to know that. They had been through too much together. The room slowly filled with low conversation. People took their seats, voices soft but edged. At the far end of the table sat Gideon Hale. Gideon was the kind of man who belonged here. Tall, almost Silas's height, but cleaner, polished. His charcoal overcoat was perfectly fitted, his posture effortless. His dark hair was combed neatly, streaked lightly with gray at the temples in a way that looked intentional rather than earned. His face was sharp, controlled, his expression calm but always on the verge of something colder. He didn't look at Silas at first. Men like Gideon never did. Next to him sat Claire Vale, Eleanor's niece. She was elegant in a quiet, distant way. Pale skin, long blonde hair pulled neatly over one shoulder. Her coat tailored in soft beige tones that contrasted with the severity in her eyes. She didn't smile. She simply observed, as though measuring everyone in the room and finding most of them lacking. Silas had seen that look before, usually right before something broke. At the head of the table stood Martin Crow. Martin was older, mid-60s, maybe more. Tall but slightly stooped, as if years of carrying other people's secrets had bent him forward. His silver hair was combed back carefully, and his thin-framed glasses rested low on his nose. His face was lined, not with softness, but with restraint. He was a man who spoke only when necessary, and when he did, people listened. He adjusted a thick folder in front of him, clearing his throat gently. "This is the last will and testament of Eleanor Vale." The room fell quiet. Silas leaned back slightly in his chair, his hands resting loosely on the table. He wasn't here for money. He had learned long ago that expecting anything from the world was a mistake. Still, he couldn't deny a flicker of something. Not hope. Something quieter. Recognition, maybe. Eleanor Vale had been different. She hadn't asked him questions he couldn't answer. She hadn't tried to fix him. She had simply allowed him to exist, on her porch, beside her garden, in the silence between words. Sometimes she would talk. Sometimes she wouldn't. But she never looked at him like he was broken. That mattered more than most people understood. Martin began reading. "To my nephew, Gideon Hale, I leave the primary holdings of Vale Development, including all associated land rights and investment portfolios." Gideon gave a small nod. No surprise, no emotion, just confirmation. "To my niece, Claire Vale, I leave the lakeside residence and accompanying financial accounts." Claire's lips pressed together slightly. Satisfaction, but controlled. The rest followed in the same rhythm. Properties, accounts, numbers that would have changed most people's lives. Silas listened, unmoving. At his feet, Rook's ears twitched once. Just once, then settled again. Minutes passed. Then Martin paused. He turned a page more slowly this time. And, finally, a shift in the room, subtle, but real. Martin's eyes lifted slightly. "To Silas Wren." For the first time, Gideon looked directly at him. Silas didn't move. Martin continued. "In recognition of his presence during my final months, I leave the sum of $5 and my personal library card." Silence, then. A quiet laugh, not loud, not crude, but sharp enough to cut. Gideon exhaled through his nose, the corner of his mouth lifting just enough to show amusement. $5, he murmured. "That's generous." Claire didn't laugh. She simply looked at Silas, her expression softer, but not kinder. Pity. That was worse. Martin reached into his pocket and placed a folded $5 bill on the table. Beside it, a worn library card. The edges were frayed, the ink slightly faded with age. They looked small, insignificant. Silas stared at them for a moment. Then he reached forward. His fingers closed around the bill first. Light, meaningless. Then the card. It felt older than it should have. Behind him, a chair shifted. But it wasn't the people that moved. It was Rook. The dog rose slowly, his movement controlled, deliberate. His claws clicked softly against the hardwood floor as he stepped forward. He didn't look at the people. He looked at the card. He lowered his head slightly, sniffed once, carefully. Then again. Something changed. His ears lifted, his posture tightened. And then, he turned his head, locking eyes with Martin Crowe. The room didn't notice, but Silas did. For a brief second, everything else disappeared. The laughter, the room, the weight of that $5 insult. All of it faded behind one simple, impossible detail. Rook wasn't reacting to the card. He was reacting to something on it, something no one else could see. And for the first time since stepping into that room, Silas felt something stir deep inside his chest. Not anger, not humiliation. Something sharper, something unfinished. Martin blinked once, almost imperceptibly, as if he had felt the shift too. Then he looked back down at his papers, continuing as though nothing had happened. The reading ended shortly after. People stood. Conversations resumed. Chairs scraped softly across the floor. Gideon passed by Silas on his way out. "Enjoy your inheritance," he said, voice smooth, controlled. "Don't spend it all in one place." Silas didn't respond. He simply stood, resting a hand briefly on Rook's neck. "Let's go," he muttered. Outside, the cold hit harder. The sky had darkened slightly, clouds pressing low over the mountains. The wind carried the scent of pine and distant snow. Silas walked to his truck, an old, rattling thing that had seen better days. Rook jumped into the passenger seat without hesitation, settling in as though this were the only place that made sense. They drove in silence. The road stretched long and empty, winding through the northern forest. Trees stood tall on either side, their branches barely moving in the cold air. It was quiet. The kind of quiet that used to calm him. Now, it just felt heavy. Back at the cabin, Silas pushed the door open, boots tracking faint dirt across the wooden floor. The space was small, simple, a stove, a table, a bed, nothing more than what he needed. Rook stepped inside, shaking off the cold. Silas dropped the $5 bill onto the table. It slid slightly, stopping near the edge. He pulled the library card from his pocket. For a moment, he just stared at it. $5, he said under his breath. He almost laughed. Almost. Then he set the card down beside the bill. Rook moved immediately. The dog stepped closer, lowering his head again, sniffing the card more carefully this time. Not curious. Focused. His tail didn't move. His breathing slowed. Silas leaned forward slightly. "What is it, boy?" Rook didn't answer. Of course he didn't. But he did something else. He lifted his head and slowly turned toward the window, toward the forest. His ears stood straight. His body went still, not relaxed, alert. Silas followed his gaze. Outside, the trees stood quiet, bathed in fading light. Morning arrived quietly over the northern forest, not with noise, but with a pale wash of light that slipped through the trees and pressed gently against the windows of Silas Wren's cabin. The world outside looked untouched, calm, cold, and distant. But inside, something had shifted. Silas stood near the small wooden table, staring at the worn library card resting beside the crumpled $5 bill. He hadn't slept much, not because of fear, not even because of curiosity. It was something harder to explain. A feeling that something had started moving again, after a long time standing still. Behind him, Rook sat upright near the door, body relaxed but alert. The dog had not taken his eyes off the outside world since dawn. His ears twitched occasionally, reacting to sounds too faint for human ears. Every now and then, his gaze drifted, not randomly, but toward the same direction. The forest. Silas rubbed the back of his neck, exhaling slowly. "All right," he muttered. "We'll take a look." Before he could reach for his jacket, a low rumble of tires broke the silence. Silas froze. Rook was already moving. The German shepherd stepped forward, placing himself between Silas and the door, his posture tightening. Not aggressive, but ready. His eyes fixed on the window. A vehicle stopped outside, engine still running. Silas moved quietly toward the side of the window, just enough to look out without exposing himself. A dark sedan, not local. The door opened. Martin Crow stepped out. Silas exhaled, tension easing, but not entirely. He opened the door halfway. Cold air rushed in. Martin stood there in his long gray coat, snow clinging lightly to the shoulders. Up close, he looked older than he had in the office. Lines deeper, eyes heavier. Not weak, just burdened. "Mr. Wren," Martin said calmly, removing his gloves. "I hope I'm not too early." "It's early," Silas replied, "but you're already here." Martin gave a faint, humorless smile. "Yes, that seems to be a pattern lately." He stepped inside after a brief pause. Rook circled him once, silently, nose low, taking in his scent. Not hostile, just thorough. Martin noticed. "That's Rook," he said quietly. "She used to talk about him." Silas raised an eyebrow. "She?" "Eleanor." Silas didn't respond. Martin walked slowly toward the table, his eyes landing on the library card. "You kept it." Silas leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Didn't feel like throwing away something I didn't understand." Martin nodded once. "That was wise." There was a pause, the kind that sits between people who both know there's more to say. Finally, Martin reached into his coat and removed a thin leather folder. "What I'm about to tell you," he said, placing it gently on the table, "was not meant to be shared unless you chose to keep that card." Silas glanced at it. "And if I hadn't?" Martin met his eyes. "Then none of this would exist for you." Silas stepped forward. "Try me." Martin opened the folder. Inside were documents. Not many, but enough to feel important. "Eleanor Vale established a private trust nearly 8 years ago," Martin said. "Cedar Hollow Trust. It exists legally, quietly, structured in layers, designed to prevent external control." Silas frowned slightly. "External control from who?" Martin didn't hesitate. "From her own family." Silas let out a slow breath. "That tracks." Martin allowed himself the faintest hint of a smile. She anticipated resistance, especially from Gideon Hale. At the name, something in the room tightened. Silas looked down at the documents. "And this trust, what does it hold?" "Land," Martin replied. "Forest land, around Cedar Hollow. Parcels purchased through different entities, different timelines. On paper, they appear unrelated. But they're not." "No," Martin said. "They form a single, continuous territory." Silas's eyes shifted slightly. "How much land?" Martin paused. 83 acres. Silas blinked once. That wasn't small. That was something worth fighting for. "Why hide it?" he asked. Martin closed the folder slowly. "Because Eleanor didn't want it turned into something else." Silas understood. He didn't need the explanation. Resorts, development, money. Things that erased places like the one outside his window. Martin gestured toward the library card. "That is the first key." Silas picked it up, turning it over. "Key to what?" Martin's answer was simple. "To access." The town of Ashmore sat quietly between forest and water, its streets lined with old buildings that looked like they had been standing long before anyone thought to change them. The library stood near the center, a brick structure with tall windows and a wooden sign faded by time. It didn't look like a place that held secrets. That made it perfect. Silas stepped inside, Rook at his side. The warmth hit first, then the smell of old paper. Behind the front desk stood a woman in her late 70s, Margaret Doyle. She was small, barely reaching Silas's shoulder, her posture slightly bent, but not fragile. Her silver hair was pulled into a neat bun, and her eyes, sharp, alert, and impossibly aware, missed nothing. Her cardigan hung loosely over her thin frame, sleeves slightly rolled as if she was always halfway through a task. She looked up. Then she saw the card. Everything changed. Her hand stilled. "Where did you get that?" she asked, voice quiet but firm. Silas held it out. "It was given to me." Margaret didn't take it immediately. Instead, she studied his face. Then Rook. The dog stood still, watching her just as carefully. After a moment, she nodded. "Come with me." She didn't ask questions. She didn't hesitate. That told Silas more than anything. They moved past the public area, through a narrow hallway, and down a set of stairs into the archives section. The air changed. Cooler, denser, filled with the weight of things no one had touched in years. Margaret stopped at a long wall of shelves. Her fingers traced along the wood until she reached a specific spot. Then she pressed. A quiet click. The shelf shifted. Silas didn't react outwardly, but something inside him sharpened. Behind it, a narrow room opened. Old, hidden, preserved. This, Margaret said softly, was Eleanor's space. Silas stepped inside. Rook followed. Immediately the dog's posture changed. His head lowered. His breathing slowed. Then he moved, not randomly, directly, toward the far corner of the room. Rook stopped at a section of the wooden floor. He didn't bark. He didn't scratch. He simply stood there, completely still. Then, slowly, he lifted one paw and placed it down on the same spot. Once, twice. A signal. Silas felt it immediately. Not logic, not reason. Instinct. The same instinct that had kept him alive in places where thinking too long meant dying. He stepped forward, kneeled, ran his fingers across the floor, and felt it. A seam. Hidden. Deliberate. And suddenly, for the first time since the will had been read, Silas wasn't being mocked anymore. He was being led. Silas pried the panel open. Inside was a narrow compartment. Dust stirred lightly as it opened. He reached in, pulled out a worn leather-bound notebook, a folded map, and several small cards covered in strange printed symbols. Martin stepped closer behind him, his breath quiet but steady. "That's it," he murmured. Silas opened the notebook. The handwriting was unmistakable, firm, deliberate. Eleanor's voice, captured in ink. He read, slowly, carefully. And as he did, the room seemed to grow quieter. The words spoke of land, purchased piece by piece, hidden behind layers of ownership. Not for profit, for preservation, for purpose, for something unfinished. Silas's grip tightened slightly. "She wasn't just buying land," he said. "No," Martin replied. "She was building something." Silas turned to the map. His eyes traced the markings. Points connected, paths, locations. And then, one place circled more heavily than the rest. Rook noticed it too. The dog stepped closer, nose hovering over the map. Then he looked up, toward the direction of the forest beyond the walls. Margaret watched silently. "She used to take people there," she said. "Veterans? Men who didn't talk much, like you." Silas didn't respond, but something inside him shifted. Not a memory, not yet, but something close. He folded the map slowly. "Where is it?" Margaret hesitated, then answered, "Old Ranger Station, north ridge of Cedar Hollow." Silas nodded once. Behind him, Martin closed the folder. "You need to understand something," he said. Silas glanced back. "If you continue this, Others will notice. Silas didn't ask who. He already knew. Across town in a glass-walled office overlooking the same quiet streets, Gideon Hale stood with his back to the window. A man sat across from him. Younger, nervous, holding a tablet too tightly. "Sir, we've had activity," the man said. Gideon didn't turn. "What kind of activity?" The man swallowed. "Someone accessed Vale Press archival records." Silence. Then, Gideon smiled. Not wide, not warm, just enough. "I was wondering when she'd try something from beyond the grave," he said. He turned slowly. "And now, we know." His eyes hardened. "Find out who." The man nodded quickly. "And if they find anything first?" Gideon stepped closer. His voice dropped. "They won't." Back in the hidden archive room, Silas stood with the map in his hand. Rook at his side, the forest waiting, for the first time in a long time. Silas didn't feel lost. He felt pulled. Not by curiosity, not by anger, but by something quieter, something that felt like direction. He looked down at Rook. The dog met his gaze, steady, certain. Silas exhaled slowly. "All right," he said. "Let's see where this goes." Rook's tail moved once. And somewhere beyond the walls, beyond the town, beyond everything that had been said and done, the forest waited. Cedar Hollow did not feel like a place that belonged to conflict. The forest opened wide beneath a soft northern sun. Light spilling through tall pines and white-barked birch trees in long golden beams. The air carried the scent of damp earth, cold water, and something faintly sweet, like leaves warming after a long winter. It was peaceful in a way that felt almost deliberate, as if the land itself resisted anything that didn't belong. Silas Wren moved through it quietly. His boots pressed into the soft ground without sound, each step measured, instinctive. He carried no weapon in his hands, but his body held the same readiness it always had. Shoulders loose, eyes scanning, mind building patterns from fragments most people wouldn't even notice. Beside him, Rook moved like a shadow. The German shepherd stayed just ahead, nose low, reading the ground, the air, the spaces between things. His tail remained still, his posture balanced, neither tense nor relaxed. Working. Silas didn't speak. He didn't need to. They had crossed terrain like this before, though not this one. Back then, it had been deserts and broken hills, places that smelled of dust and danger. This forest was different, alive, quiet, deceptively calm. But silence had never meant safety. After nearly 20 minutes, Silas slowed. Rook had stopped. The dog's head lifted slightly, ears tilting forward. Not alarmed, focused, Silas followed his line of sight. Someone stood ahead. A woman. She stepped out from behind a cluster of birch trees, her movements cautious, but not fearful. She raised one hand slowly, palm open, signaling she wasn't a threat. Silas didn't move. "Easy," she said. Her voice was steady, clear, grounded. She was in her mid-30s, maybe a year or two younger than him. About 1.68 meters tall, with a lean, practical build that suggested someone used to moving outdoors. Her moss-green Ranger parka was worn at the sleeves, not from neglect, but from use. Beneath it, a gray sweater, simple and functional. Dark outdoor pants tucked into waterproof boots. Her hair, chestnut brown, fell just past her shoulders, tied loosely at the back. A few strands escaped, catching the light. Her face wasn't delicate. It was defined, alert. Eyes sharp, intelligent. The kind that didn't miss details. There was something else in them, too. Familiarity. She looked at Rook first. German Shepherd, she said quietly. Working line. Military, right? Silas gave a small nod. Used to be. She shifted her gaze to him. You're Silas Wren. It wasn't a question. Silas narrowed his eyes slightly. And you are? Mara Bell. She lowered her hand slowly. I worked with Eleanor. That changed things. Not trust, but direction. Silas stepped closer, not threatening, but not open either. What kind of work? Mara exhaled softly, glancing briefly at the trees around them. Community health, she said. Mostly veterans. Trauma recovery, reintegration programs. She paused, then added, Eleanor funded most of it. Silas studied her. Her stance was steady, no hesitation, no attempt to impress. Truth, then. Why are you here? He asked. Mara gave a faint, almost tired smile. Because you are. That answer lingered. Silas looked down briefly at Rook. The dog remained calm, no warning signs, no tension. That was enough, for now. Then walk, Silas said, and talk. They moved together now, deeper into Cedar Hollow. Mara kept a steady pace beside Silas, matching his rhythm without trying to lead. She spoke as they walked, her voice blending naturally with the quiet of the forest. Eleanor didn't just buy land, she said. She studied people, especially the ones no one else paid attention to. Silas said nothing. She noticed patterns, Mara continued. Men who came back from war, but never really came back. They drifted. Some disappeared. Some stayed, but never lived. Silas's jaw tightened slightly. She believed the environment mattered, Mara said. Silence, space, nature. Not therapy rooms, not hospitals, something else. Silas finally spoke. A place to breathe. Mara nodded. Exactly. Rook moved ahead, weaving through low brush and fallen branches. Every few steps, he paused, checking, confirming, then continuing. Silas watched him closely. What made you stay? He asked. Mara hesitated. For a moment, the forest filled the space. My brother, she said finally. He served, came back. Different. Couldn't sit still. Couldn't sleep. Couldn't be around people. Silas didn't look at her, but he was listening. Eleanor helped him, Mara continued. Not by fixing him, just by giving him somewhere to exist without being judged. A faint breath escaped her. It worked. For a while. Silas understood that kind of ending. He didn't ask more. Ahead, the trees thinned slightly. A structure emerged. The ranger station. It stood quiet and weathered at the edge of a small clearing, its wooden frame leaning just slightly under the weight of time. Moss clung to the lower walls. The roof sagged at one corner, but not enough to collapse. It looked abandoned, but not forgotten. Rook slowed as they approached. His body lowered slightly, nose catching something on the air. Silas felt it too, not as a scent, but as a shift. Something was wrong. He raised a hand. Mara stopped immediately, no words. Rook moved forward alone, steps lighter now, almost silent. He circled wide, approaching the structure from the side. Silas followed, keeping distance. Then he saw it. Boot prints. Fresh. Not many, but enough. Mara stepped closer, crouching slightly. Not old, she said quietly. Silas nodded. Rook moved again. He paused near the doorway, nose hovering just above the ground. His breathing changed, shorter, more focused. Then he lifted his head. The wind shifted. and with it came a faint smell. Metal, oil, not old, recent. Silas's eyes hardened. "They're ahead of us," he said. Mara looked at him. "You mean Gideon?" Silas didn't answer directly. "Someone knows where to look," he said. They entered the station carefully. The interior was dim, light filtering through broken windows in thin, uneven lines. Dust covered most surfaces, but not evenly. Some areas were disturbed. A table sat near the center of the room. On it, papers. Not organized. Searched. Silas stepped closer. "Someone's been here," Mara said, unnecessarily. Silas picked up one of the sheets. Blank. He set it down. Rook moved past them, deeper into the station. His pace slowed. Then he stopped. Rook stood in front of the far wall, not moving, not sniffing, just staring. Silas approached slowly. "What is it?" The dog didn't react. His eyes were fixed on something. Silas followed his gaze. There, barely visible in the dim light, a photograph, pinned to the wall, old, faded, but untouched. Everything else in the room had been disturbed, except that. Silas reached for it. His fingers brushed the edge, and for a brief second, a strange, quiet stillness filled the room. Not sound, not silence, something in between, like the air itself was holding its breath. He pulled the photograph free. A group of men stood together in front of this very station. Different ages, different faces, but all the same posture. Soldiers. At their feet, dogs, German shepherds, working dogs, alive, alert. Rook stepped closer. His nose hovered over the image, tracing the shapes. Then he sat. Silas turned the photograph over. There, written in careful, deliberate ink. Some of them never came home, even when they survived. The words settled into him slowly, not as information, as recognition. Mara exhaled quietly. "She brought them here," she said. "This was one of the first places." Silas looked around the room again, not as a structure, as a memory, a place where people had tried to begin again. Rook stood. Suddenly, his body shifted, tense now, alert, not curiosity, warning. Silas felt it immediately. He moved toward the window just enough to look out. Nothing, just trees, still, too still. He stepped back. "They're close," he said quietly. Mara's voice dropped. "Do we leave?" Silas shook his head once. "Not yet." He folded the photograph carefully, slipping it into his jacket. Rook moved toward the door, not retreating, positioning. Silas understood. "All right," he murmured. "Let's see who else is hunting." Outside, the forest remained beautiful, quiet, unchanged. But now, Silas knew better. This wasn't just a search anymore. It was a race. And somewhere out there, someone else was already running. The road to Vale Press curved along the edge of the lake like an old thought returning after years of silence. Late afternoon light moved across the water in broken silver bands, and the forest beyond the shoreline stood bright and windless, as if the whole of Cedar Hollow had paused to listen. Silas Wren drove without speaking. His hands rested steady on the wheel, though there was a hard stillness in his shoulders that Mara had begun to recognize. It was not fear. Men like Silas did not fear easily. It was the tension of someone who had lived too long in places where quiet often arrived just before violence. Beside him, Rook sat upright in the passenger seat, black and tan coat gleaming softly whenever sunlight cut through the windshield. The German shepherd's ears shifted at every sound. The hum of the engine, the scrape of gravel, the distant call of birds across the water. His body looked calm, but his eyes kept moving, alert and intelligent, always measuring. He had been that way since they left the ranger station. Not agitated, focused. Mara Bell sat in the back seat with the old photograph and Eleanor's map folded carefully in her lap. She looked out the side window as the shape of the printing house came into view. Vale Press stood near the lake like a forgotten chapel built for words instead of prayer. The brick and wood structure had once been handsome in a practical, dignified way. Now its tall windows were filmed with dust, and the paint along the frames had peeled in long curling strips. Ivy crept up one wall. The sign above the entrance, Vale Press, was still there, though weather had faded the gold leaf into something dimmer and sadder. Silas parked and stepped out first. The air smelled of lake water, damp timber, and old paper left too long in summer heat. Rook jumped down beside him and immediately scanned the open ground, nose lifting once toward the wind. Mara followed, tightening her parka against the breeze. The front door opened before they reached it. A small woman stood in the doorway, one hand still on the brass handle. She looked to be somewhere between 75 and 80, with white hair pinned into a practical knot and a narrow face marked by age, intelligence, and long memory. She was short, but there was nothing frail about her presence. Her cardigan was dark gray, worn smooth at the elbows, and a faded apron lay over her skirt, stained with old printer's ink, as if the years had soaked into cloth and refused to leave. Thin spectacles sat low on her nose. Her eyes were bright. This was Elspeth Vale. She looked first at Mara, then at Silas, then finally at Rook. "So," she said, her voice dry but not unkind, "the dog is real." Mara blinked. "You were expecting the dog?" Elspeth stepped aside to let them in. Eleanor wrote many things down. She rarely exaggerated. "Come in before the light goes." The interior of Vale Press smelled exactly the way the outside promised it would. Ink, wood pulp, iron, dust, and the faint mineral scent of lake air slipping through old walls. The main room opened wide beneath a high ceiling crossed by thick beams blackened with age. Long tables sat beneath hanging lamps. Drawer cabinets lined the walls, each filled with metal type, labels, and forgotten tools. At the center stood the old printing press, heavy, iron-bodied, and beautiful in the way old machines sometimes are, as if they had once possessed a soul borrowed from the people who worked them. Rook moved more slowly here. Not because he was uncertain, because he was reading everything. His paws made soft sounds on the old plank floor as he circled once, nose low. He paused beside a cabinet, then the press, then the staircase leading to the back loft. Silas watched him out of habit, but his own attention kept drifting to the press itself. It dominated the room the way certain men used to dominate a command tent, silent, scarred, and carrying the weight of everything built around it. Elspeth noticed. "She bought that press with her husband," she said, "before the company split into papers and deeds and all the modern nonsense. Back then, this place printed church bulletins, town notices, missing person posters, poetry pamphlets, war letters, and funeral cards. Eleanor used to say ink told the truth more honestly than most people." Mara walked slowly beside one of the long tables, fingertips grazing its edge. "You stayed?" Elspeth gave a thin smile. Somebody had to remember how the place breathed. She looked at Silas then, really looked at him. He stood in his olive field jacket, broad shoulders filling the soft gloom of the room, blue-gray eyes alert beneath the hard angles of his face. He looked too large for the quiet house of paper and type, but not wrong inside it. Just out of season. Like a soldier who had entered a library by mistake and discovered something there knew his name. "You do resemble him," Elspeth said. Silas's jaw tightened slightly. Her son? Yes. Mara glanced between them. You knew? Elspeth nodded once. Not at first. But grief has patterns. Eleanor had spent years looking for one thing in broken men. Not strength, not obedience. Recognition. Silas did not answer. Elspeth reached into the pocket of her apron and removed a small brass key. The symbols from the map? Mara unfolded the cards from the archive and handed them over. Elspeth studied them beneath the nearest lamp. Her old fingers moved with practiced precision across the marks, pausing now and then as if listening to the language beneath them. These aren't random printer codes, she murmured. They're lock marks. Position, pressure, sequence. She looked toward the press. Eleanor hid things the way some women hide jewelry. Inside work. They gathered around the machine. Elspeth pointed out a series of nearly invisible notches carved into the side frame, each aligned with a small dial and plate beneath the main roller bed. Silas followed her instructions, turning one lever, then another. The metal resisted at first, then yielded with a slow, reluctant groan. Nothing happened. Elspeth frowned. Mara leaned closer. Did we miss one? Rook, who had been circling near the back of the press, stopped abruptly. He lifted his head, sniffed toward the machine, then placed one paw against the wooden feedboard that extended from its front. Not a scratch, not a strike, just pressure. Silas looked down at him, then at the board. There, Elspeth whispered. He pushed. A hidden latch gave way. The side panel of the press shifted inward with a deep metallic click, and a narrow compartment slid open from inside the iron frame. For a moment, no one moved. Inside lay three things: a leather packet tied with faded ribbon, a small recorder with 2 labeled tapes, and a sealed folder bearing Eleanor Vale's name in firm black script. Mara let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding. Elspeth closed her eyes briefly, not in surprise, but in the ache of old loyalty fulfilled. You stubborn woman, she murmured to the absent dead. Silas reached in and lifted the recorder first. It was older, but well preserved. The tape was marked simply, "For the one who stays." He looked at Mara, then Elspeth. Do we have a player? Elspeth turned without a word and crossed to a cabinet near the back wall. From its bottom shelf she pulled a small cassette player wrapped in cloth. She set it on the table, plugged it into the wall, and pressed the tape into place. The machine clicked. Static breathed. Then a woman's voice filled the room. Eleanor's. Age had roughened it, but it remained unmistakably deliberate. Calm, educated. A woman who had spent a lifetime speaking only after she had decided her words mattered. If you are hearing this, she said, then at least one faithful heart has outrun the impatient ones. Mara lowered her eyes. Silas stood completely still. Eleanor continued. She spoke not like someone dictating instructions, but like someone handing over the last weight she had been forced to carry alone. She explained the Cedar Hollow Trust, the layered legal structure, the hidden parcels purchased through shell entities and conservation fronts. She named no enemies directly, yet Gideon's shadow seemed to stand in the room all the same. Then her voice changed. Not weaker, more personal. My son came home from war, she said, but he did not return. The words settled heavily into the press room. He survived what foreign soil could not take from him. But this country, in its haste to celebrate and forget, asked him to become ordinary before his wounds had even learned how to speak. He drowned slowly while the rest of us called it adjustment. Silas's stare shifted toward the far wall. Somewhere deep inside him, something old tightened. "I could not save him," Eleanor said. "But I learned something from losing him. There are men who survive battle only to be abandoned by peace. There are dogs who remain more loyal than nations. There must be places where both are allowed to heal without apology." Mara pressed one hand lightly over her mouth. Rook had gone still beside Silas's leg, head lifted toward the sound, as if he understood the sorrow inside the voice. Eleanor explained that Cedar Hollow was meant to become a place of recovery. For veterans, for working dogs retired from service, for men who could no longer fit inside normal lives. She had chosen secrecy because those closest to her would have sold the land piece by piece and called it progress. Then came the part that changed the air in the room. "I did not choose Silas Wren because he is perfect," she said. "I chose him because he knows what it means to keep moving while carrying what should have killed him. And because the dog trusts him still." Silas closed his eyes for one brief second. The fish camp lay deeper than most people would ever go. Not because it was far, but because it felt like a place the world had quietly decided to forget. Silas Wren drove the last mile along a narrow dirt road that barely deserved to be called one. The trees closed in tighter here, branches arching overhead like ribs, forming a tunnel of green and shadow. Sunlight filtered through in thin, fractured beams, broken by leaves and drifting mist from the falls somewhere ahead. He didn't rush. Men who rushed made mistakes. Beside him, Rook stood braced in the passenger seat, front paws steady, head slightly forward. His ears flicked with each subtle shift in sound, the whisper of wind through reeds, the distant rush of water, something else beneath it all. Mara sat in the back, gripping the edge of her seat lightly, not out of fear, but anticipation. Her eyes moved constantly, scanning, absorbing. "You've been here before?" she asked quietly. Silas shook his head. "No," he said. "But I know places like this." Mara nodded. So did Eleanor. The truck stopped near the edge of the clearing. The fish camp revealed itself slowly. It wasn't much. A few weathered wooden platforms stretching over shallow water. A narrow walkway leading out toward a small dock, its boards warped and darkened by years of moisture. Reeds grew thick along the shoreline, swaying softly in the cold breeze. Beyond them, the water flowed gently toward a low cascade, the shallow falls Eleanor had spoken of. The place felt still, not empty, waiting. Silas stepped out first. Rook followed immediately, landing lightly, already moving, circling once, nose down, tracing patterns invisible to human eyes. His body language shifted within seconds. Not calm anymore. Aware. Mara stepped out behind them, pulling her parka tighter. "It's beautiful," she murmured. Silas didn't answer. He was already watching the ground. Boot prints, again. Fresh. Not just one person this time. Multiple. Spread out. Methodical. "Private team," he said quietly. Mara's voice lowered. "Gideon." Silas nodded once. "He doesn't know exactly what he's looking for," Silas said. "But he knows it's here." Rook moved ahead along the wooden walkway, stepping lightly despite the age of the boards. His nails barely made a sound. Silas followed, weight distributed carefully, testing each step. The wood creaked under pressure, old, unstable. Water moved beneath them in soft, endless motion. Mara hesitated for a second before stepping onto the walkway, eyes flicking down at the dark water below. "You ever think about how quiet places like this are?" she asked. Silas didn't look back. Only when they stopped being quiet. They moved deeper. The walkway split into two narrow paths, one leading toward the dock, the other circling along the reeds toward a small hut built on stilts above the water. Rook stopped at the split. His head turned slightly, listening. Then he chose. Left, toward the hut. Silas didn't question it. He followed. The air felt colder here, not temperature, something else. Mara noticed it too. "This is where he came," she said softly. "Eleanor's son." Silas stepped onto the final stretch of boards leading to the hut. The door hung slightly open. Not broken. Opened. Recently. Silas raised a hand. Mara froze behind him. Rook stepped forward, slow now, controlled. Then he stopped. His body tightened. Not warning. Decision. Rook turned back toward Silas. For a brief second, their eyes met. And in that look, there was no confusion, no hesitation, only intent. Then, without a sound, Rook broke away. Not forward, not toward the hut, but sideways, cutting sharply off the walkway, dropping into the reeds and vanishing into the tall grass. Mara gasped softly. "Silas!" But Silas didn't move, because he understood. That wasn't panic. That was training, diversion. A second later, voices, low, close, from the opposite side of the clearing. Silas's eyes hardened. "They're here," Mara whispered. "What do we do?" Silas didn't look at her. "We don't run." He stepped forward, into the hut. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and old fish oil. The space was small, a narrow table, a broken chair, hooks along the wall where nets once hung. Dust lay thick, but disturbed. Recently. Silas moved quickly, scanning. Nothing obvious, nothing left out. That meant it was hidden. He dropped to one knee, running his hand along the floorboards. Listening, feeling. Outside, footsteps moved through the reeds. Closer now. Mara stood near the doorway, watching, breath controlled but tight. "Silas." He ignored the urgency in her voice. He found it. A slight difference in the wood grain. A seam. He pried it open with the tip of his knife. The panel lifted. Inside, a wrapped bundle. He pulled it free, unwrapped it quickly. A carved wooden seal. Old, heavy, veil press, and beneath it, a set of documents. Clean, protected, final confirmations, the last piece. Silas exhaled once. "Got it." Mara turned. Too late. A shadow moved across the doorway. A man stepped in. Tall, broad, dressed in dark tactical clothing, black jacket, reinforced boots, gloves. His face was sharp, unshaven, with a thin scar running from his temple down toward his cheekbone. His eyes were flat, trained, the kind that measured threat before emotion. Caleb Dorsey. Late 30s. Former military, if the posture said anything. Now something else. Private security. He raised a hand slightly. "Easy," he said. His voice was calm, controlled, professional. "Hand it over." Silas didn't move. "Don't think so." Dorsey's gaze flicked briefly to the documents in Silas's hand, then back to his eyes. "You don't understand what you're holding." Silas gave a faint, humorless smile. "I understand enough." Behind Dorsey, more movement. 2 more men approaching, time shrinking. Mara stepped back, eyes darting. "Silas?" Dorsey took 1 step forward. "Last chance." Silas didn't answer. Instead, he moved, fast. He shoved the table sideways, the wood crashing into Dorsey's knees, throwing off his balance for just a second. "Enough." Silas grabbed Mara's arm. "Move!" They burst out the back of the hut. The walkway shook under their weight as they ran. The boards creaked, groaned, shifted dangerously. Behind them, shouts, boots pounding, water splashing. The chase began. The open space worked against them. No cover, no concealment, just narrow wood, unstable ground, and water that would slow anyone who fell into it. Mara slipped once. Silas caught her. "Keep moving!" Gunfire cracked behind them. Not aimed to kill. Warning, pressure. They reached the split in the walkway. Silas made a decision instantly. "Right!" They cut across the narrower path toward the dock. The wood here was worse. Slick, warped. Mara nearly fell again. Silas kept her moving behind them. Dorsey regained ground. Faster, more controlled. He wasn't rushing. He was hunting. Then, a sound. A bark, sharp, from the reeds. Rook. The dog burst from the grass on the opposite side of the clearing, moving fast, drawing attention, drawing eyes, drawing movement. Dorsey reacted immediately, turning, adjusting, diverted, exactly as planned. Silas didn't slow. They reached the end of the dock. Nowhere left. Water ahead, reeds to the side. Mara looked at him. "What now?" Silas turned, just in time to see Dorsey closing the distance again. No more space. No more time. Then, Rook reappeared, charging straight toward them, but not stopping. He slammed into Dorsey from the side, hard. The man stumbled, losing footing for just a second. But enough. A shot fired. Wild. Rook yelped. A sharp, brief sound. Silas's heart stopped. "Rook!" The dog hit the ground, rolled, then scrambled back up, limping slightly, but moving. Alive. Still moving. Still fighting. Silas made the decision. Not tactical, not strategic. Personal. He turned, back toward them. Mara shouted, "Silas, no!" But he was already moving, back into the fight. He reached Rook in 2 strides, dropping to one knee. Blood. Not deep, but real. Rook's eyes locked onto his. Steady, still focused, still ready. "You're good," Silas muttered. "You're still good." The dog's tail flicked once. That was enough. Silas stood, turned, faced Dorsey again. The man had recovered, breathing controlled, eyes sharper now. "You should have left," Dorsey said quietly. Silas shook his head. "Not how this ends." Behind him, Mara stood frozen between fear and disbelief. Because she understood something now. This wasn't about escape anymore. This was about choosing not to walk away. Silas stepped forward, Rook at his side, despite the limp, despite the blood. Together. And for the first time since this began, Silas wasn't running. The town hall in Ashmore had never been built for conflict. It was a simple structure. White-painted wood, wide windows, a bell tower that hadn't been used in years. Inside, rows of old chairs faced a raised platform, where decisions were usually made quietly, politely, and without consequence. Today felt different. The room was already full when Silas Wren stepped through the front door. People turned. Not all at once, not dramatically, just enough for the shift to be felt. Silas paused for half a second, letting his eyes adjust. The same calm posture, the same worn olive field jacket, the same quiet weight in his presence. His boots carried dust from the forest floor into polished civic space. It didn't belong here. Neither did he. Behind him, Mara Bell walked in with steady steps, her moss-green parka zipped halfway, hair tied loosely back. She carried a thin folder under her arm, papers marked and organized, her eyes focused forward. She didn't look nervous. She looked prepared. Rook entered last. The German shepherd moved at Silas's side, body aligned with his stride, head slightly lowered but eyes alert. The dog's presence drew whispers, low, uncertain, some curious, some uneasy. He ignored them. Silas moved toward the front row. At the far end of the room, Gideon Hale stood already at the podium. He looked exactly as expected, immaculate. His charcoal overcoat had been replaced by a tailored suit, perfectly fitted, dark and precise. His hair was combed cleanly, his posture relaxed but controlled. He greeted people as they entered, offering polite nods, quiet smiles. The version of himself he showed the world. A man who built things. A man who made sense. On a table beside him sat presentation boards, maps, development plans, architectural renderings, clean lines, bright colors, promises made visible, opportunity. Silas studied them briefly. He had seen something like this before. In another country? Different language, same outcome. At the back of the room stood Martin Crowe, hands folded loosely in front of him. He wore the same gray coat, the same quiet composure. But today, there was something more beneath it. Resolve. Near him, several townspeople gathered, older men, women, a few younger workers. Among them stood two individuals Mara had spoken to earlier. One was Thomas Keegan, a man in his early 60s with a long, narrow face and thinning gray hair. His build was lean, almost gaunt, as though life had carved him down to essentials. He wore a brown canvas jacket and carried a leather notebook under one arm. His eyes held the restless intensity of someone who had spent too long watching things go wrong without being able to stop them. The other was Rachel Dunn, mid-40s, strong-shouldered, sun-worn skin, hair pulled into a tight braid. She wore work clothes, denim and flannel, and stood with arms crossed, not defensive, but anchored. She looked like someone who had built things with her hands and expected others to earn the right to speak. Witnesses. Mara's witnesses. At the far side of the room, Sheriff Nolan Pierce leaned against the wall. He hadn't chosen a seat. That said everything. Pierce was a tall man in his early 50s, broad through the shoulders, with a square face marked by a faint scar along his jawline. His brown sheriff's jacket hung open over a dark shirt, badge catching the light occasionally as he shifted his weight. His hair was short, graying at the edges, his eyes unreadable, neutral, or so everyone thought. The meeting was called to order. Gideon stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice smooth, practiced. "We are here today to discuss the future of Cedar Hollow." His tone carried easily, not loud, convincing. He spoke of opportunity, jobs, infrastructure, growth. He moved through his presentation with calm confidence, pointing to maps, outlining phased development, explaining projected revenue. His words were measured, reasonable, almost reassuring. "People cannot live on memory," he said at one point, pausing just long enough for the sentence to settle. "They need stability, work, a future they can see." Heads nodded, some more than others. Silas remained still. Beside him, Rooks shifted slightly, ears flicking once as a man coughed 2 rows behind them. Mara listened carefully, her expression tightening not with anger, but recognition. She had heard arguments like this before. Logical, clean, incomplete. Gideon finished to polite applause. He stepped back. The room felt balanced. Not decided, not yet. Martin moved forward next. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't try to compete. He simply began. "The Cedar Hollow Trust," he said, "exists under federal and state protection." He laid out the legal structure clearly, documents, filings, protections layered carefully over time, not dramatic, just undeniable. Silas watched the room shift again. Less confident now, more uncertain, Mara stepped forward after him. Her voice was different, not polished, real. She spoke of the veterans who had come back broken, not visibly, but quietly. She spoke of the programs Eleanor had funded, the land used not for profit, but for healing. She introduced Thomas and Rachel, who stepped forward to confirm her words. Thomas spoke slowly, carefully choosing each word. "I've seen what happens when places like this disappear," he said. "People don't vanish all at once. They fade." Rachel's voice was stronger. "My brother didn't need a job," she said. "He needed somewhere that didn't expect him to be someone else." The room held that. Silas stood last. He didn't step to the podium. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he placed 3 things on the table in front of him. The wooden veil press seal, the trust documents, the recorder. He pressed play. Eleanor's voice filled the room. Not loud, but enough. People leaned forward. Something changed. Not in the air, in them. Silas didn't speak when the recording ended. He didn't need to. The silence did it for him. Rook moved. Not toward Silas, not toward the door, but toward the side aisle. Slowly, deliberately. His nose lowered, tracing something unseen. Silas noticed immediately. The dog stopped beside a man seated near the edge of the room. Mid-30s, clean-shaven, well-dressed. Too well-dressed for Ashmore. His name, though few knew it, was Ethan Cole. He worked for Gideon, an assistant. But not just that. His posture betrayed him. Too stiff, too aware. Rook stood beside him, staring. Not growling, not barking, just watching. Ethan shifted, once, then again. His hand moved toward his jacket pocket. Small movement, but wrong. Silas's eyes sharpened. "Don't," he said quietly. The word cut through the room. Ethan froze. Too late. Sheriff Pierce pushed off the wall. 2 steps, 3. He reached Ethan before anyone else could react. "Hands where I can see them," Pierce said calmly. No shouting, no drama, authority. Ethan hesitated, then complied. Pierce reached into his jacket, pulled out a folded set of documents, stamped, official-looking. But something about them, off. Pierce glanced once, then again. His jaw tightened slightly. "These are forged," he said. The word landed hard. The room shifted. Gideon stepped forward quickly. "Sheriff, I think there's been a misunderstanding." Pierce turned toward him. Not aggressive, not loud, just certain. "I don't think there has." He held up the documents. "These filings attempt to reclassify protected land under false pretense. That's not development, Mr. Hale. That's fraud." The silence that followed wasn't quiet. It was heavy. Gideon didn't speak immediately. For the first time since the meeting began, he didn't have control. Silas watched him, not with anger, with clarity. This was the moment. Not of victory, of truth. Gideon's expression changed. Not much, but enough. The mask didn't break. It slipped, just slightly, enough for everyone to see the man behind it. And the room responded, not loudly, but decisively. Sheriff Pierce stepped back. Ethan was escorted quietly out. The forged documents remained on the table. Visible, undeniable. The council members spoke among themselves. Short, direct, no debate now. The vote was called. Hands raised, one by one. Not unanimous, but clear. Gideon's project, denied. The meeting ended without applause, without ceremony. People stood slowly, conversations beginning again, but softer now, more thoughtful. Mara exhaled, tension leaving her shoulders for the first time since the forest. "It's over," she said quietly. Silas shook his head slightly. "No," he said. "Not over." Rook returned to his side, sitting calmly, as if nothing unusual had happened. But everything had. Silas looked at the table, the seal, the documents, the recorder, then at the people. At Mara. At the sheriff. At the room. "This isn't about stopping him," Silas said. "It's about finishing what she started." Outside, the town of Ashmore stood unchanged. But something inside it had chosen. Spring came slowly to Cedar Hollow, not as a sudden burst of green, but as a quiet return of life, one small change at a time. Snow melted into thin streams that traced their way through the forest floor. The lake lost its gray stillness and began to reflect the sky again. Birds returned first, then the insects, then the faint sound of wind moving through leaves that hadn't been there a week before. The land breathed again, and this time, it didn't feel forgotten. Silas Wren stood at the edge of the field, hands resting loosely at his sides, watching the morning unfold. The same olive field jacket hung from his shoulders, the same worn boots pressed into the damp earth. But something about him had shifted, not outwardly, not in the way others would notice, but inside, something had settled. The field stretched out before him, no longer wild and untouched, but not controlled either. Wooden fencing marked out sections of land, simple and practical. A few cabins had been restored, nothing luxurious, just clean spaces with open doors and wide windows. Paths had been cleared, not cut through, but shaped carefully to follow the natural flow of the terrain. This wasn't development. This was respect. Behind him, a voice called out, "Hey, try again, slower this time." Silas turned. Across the field, Mara Bell stood beside a young man holding the leash of a German shepherd that was clearly not cooperating. The dog pulled hard to the side, restless, unsure, reacting more to the handler's tension than anything else. Mara crouched slightly, her moss-green parka brushing the grass as she adjusted her posture. "Don't fight him," she said calmly. "He feels that." The young man nodded, though his grip remained tight. This was Evan Carter. Mid-20s, lean, almost too thin for his height, like he had lost weight and never quite gained it back. His dark hair was cut short but uneven, his jaw clean but tight, as if he was constantly holding something in. His eyes were the kind that didn't rest, moving quickly, scanning everything, but never settling. A veteran, recent. Still carrying it, Silas could see it without asking. The dog beside him, a young German shepherd, maybe 2 years old, matched his energy perfectly. Nervous, reactive, not aggressive, but unsure where the world ended and he began. Mara reached out slowly, placing a hand lightly on the dog's shoulder. "Breathe," she said. Not to the dog, to Evan. The young man exhaled, just slightly. The dog responded almost instantly. Not obedience, connection. Silas watched quietly. This was the work now. Not missions, not orders. Moments like this. Small, unseen, but real. At his side, Rook stood still, observing. The German shepherd had changed too. His movements were steady again, his strength returned, but a faint scar traced along his shoulder, hidden beneath thick fur, visible only when the light caught it just right. A mark. Not of injury, of choice. Silas reached down, resting a hand briefly on Rook's neck. "You still got it," he murmured. Rook's tail moved once. Across the field, the young dog finally stopped pulling. Evan's grip loosened. For the first time since Silas had seen him, the man smiled. Not fully, not easily, but enough. Later that afternoon, a truck pulled slowly up the dirt road. Silas glanced toward it without urgency. He recognized it. Martin Crow stepped out, adjusting his coat as he looked across the property. His movements were slower these days, more deliberate, but his eyes remained sharp, observant. He walked toward Silas, hands tucked lightly into his pockets. "I see you didn't turn it into a resort," Martin said. Silas shook his head. "Didn't seem like the point." Martin nodded. "No," he said, "it didn't." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the field. Then Martin reached into his coat and handed Silas a thin envelope. "Final confirmations," he said. "The trust is fully activated, legally protected, no more challenges." Silas took it, didn't open it. "Gideon?" he asked. Martin's expression shifted slightly. "He's redirecting his efforts elsewhere," he said carefully. Silas gave a faint, dry smile. "That's one way to say it." Martin met his eyes. "You didn't destroy him," he said. "You gave him nowhere to stand." Silas didn't respond, because that wasn't what mattered. Not anymore. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the field, Rook suddenly lifted his head. Not sharply, not urgently, but with purpose. His ears angled toward the far edge of the property. Silas noticed immediately. "What is it?" Rook didn't move forward, didn't bark. He simply stood there, watching. Then slowly, he turned his head toward the cabins, toward the people, toward the life that had begun to take shape here. And for a brief, quiet moment, Silas understood something that had nothing to do with danger. Rook wasn't sensing a threat. He was checking, making sure it was still there, that it hadn't disappeared, that something worth protecting had finally stayed. Evening settled over Cedar Hollow in layers of gold and soft blue. The training ended gradually, not with commands, but with tired laughter and slow movement back toward the cabins. The dogs followed willingly, some bounding ahead, others staying close to their handlers. Evan lingered near the fence, watching his dog lie down for the first time without pulling. He glanced toward Silas. "Hey," he called. Silas turned. The young man hesitated, then stepped closer. "I didn't think this would work," Evan said. "Not for me." Silas studied him briefly. "Still doesn't," he replied. Evan blinked. Silas shrugged slightly. "You just stopped fighting it." The young man considered that, then nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly. Silas gave him a small, almost invisible nod. That was enough. Inside the main cabin, a small fire burned steadily in the iron stove. Mara stood near the table, organizing papers, intake forms, schedules, notes written in her precise, clean handwriting. She glanced up as Silas entered. "Martin said it's official," she said. Silas nodded. He did. She studied him for a moment. "You okay with that?" Silas looked around the room, at the maps, the notes, the quiet order of something being built slowly. "Yeah," he said. After a pause, he added, "I think I am." Mara smiled. Not wide, not dramatic, but real. Later, after the last light faded, Silas stepped outside again. The lake lay still, reflecting the first stars of the evening. The air had cooled, carrying the faint scent of pine and water. Rook followed him, settling down near the edge of the porch. Silas leaned against the railing, looking out over Cedar Hollow. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he reached into his jacket, pulled out two things: the library card and the $5 bill. They were no longer loose, no longer forgotten. Now, they rested inside a simple wooden frame, the glass catching the last of the fading light. He had placed them there earlier that day, not as a reminder of what had happened, but of what had started. Silas set the frame on the railing beside him. Rook lifted his head slightly, glancing at it, then back at the lake. Silas exhaled slowly. "She didn't leave money," he said quietly. Rook's ears twitched. "She left a job." The dog's tail moved once. That was enough. Silas looked out across the water. For years he had carried a sense of distance, like he was always standing just outside of wherever he was supposed to be. Not anymore. The feeling wasn't gone, but it had changed, softened, shifted into something else, something steadier. Belonging wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It just stayed. Silas rested his hand on Rook's head. "Guess we're not going anywhere," he murmured. Rook leaned slightly into the touch. The stars reflected quietly across the lake. And for the first time in a long time, Silas Wren wasn't searching for something ahead. He was standing exactly where he was meant to be. There are moments in life that look small, almost meaningless, like a worn library card, or a few dollars placed into the hands of someone the world has already overlooked. But sometimes, those are the very things God uses to open a door no one else can see. This story was never really about land or money or winning against someone stronger. It was about being chosen for something deeper, about a man who thought he had lost everything, and a loyal dog who never stopped standing beside him. And in that quiet loyalty, in that unshaken bond, something greater was at work. Maybe that's how miracles truly happen. Not in loud, overwhelming moments, but in the small, steady steps. In the second chances. In the places where broken people begin to heal. In the way a dog senses what a human heart cannot say. In the way God places us exactly where we are needed, even when we don't understand it at first. If you are watching this right now, maybe you felt lost too. Maybe you've walked through your own battles, carrying things no one else can see. Just remember this: your story is not over. What feels like the end may only be the beginning of something God has been preparing all along. Sometimes the greatest gift is not what we receive, but what we are trusted to build. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who might need it today. Leave a comment and tell me where you are watching from, and what part of this journey stayed with you the most. And if you believe in stories about loyalty, purpose, and second chances, don't forget to subscribe to Veteran Dog Stories so you don't miss the next one. May God bless you, guide your steps, and bring peace to your heart, no matter where you are in your journey today.